The Ocean's Dark Secret, uncovering the 1960s submarine mystery. You're walking along the rocky coastline at dawn, searching for driftwood, when something catches your eye wedged between the barnacle-covered rocks. At first glance, it looks like seaweed, dark, tangled, moving with the tide. But as you get closer, your blood turns to ice. It's hair. Human hair attached to what remains of a skull, picked clean by months of salt water and sea creatures. The eye sockets stare up at you, empty and accusing, while a tattered piece of Navy-issue uniform clings to nearby rocks like a maritime death shroud. You stumble backward, your hands shaking as one terrible question echoes in your mind. How long has someone been lying about what really happened to the submarine officer who supposedly died a hero's death 6 months ago? This is the story of Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, a decorated Navy submarine officer whose mysterious disappearance in 1962 was explained away as a classified mission gone wrong. For 6 months, his family mourned a war hero. But what they were about to discover would expose a web of lies, betrayal, and murder that reached from the depths of the Atlantic Ocean to the highest levels of naval command. This is the Ocean's Dark Secret, uncovering the 1960s submarine mystery. Meet the Morrison family of Groton, Connecticut, living in a modest 2-story house just 3 miles from the naval submarine base where dreams and nightmares are built in equal measure. It's 1962, and the Cold War casts a shadow over every military family in America, but especially those connected to the submarine service. The silent warriors who disappear beneath the waves for months at a time. Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, 34, is everything the Navy wants in a submarine officer. Brilliant, disciplined, and utterly dedicated to his country. With his piercing blue eyes and confident smile, James looks like he stepped out of a recruiting poster. He served on 3 different submarines over his 12-year career, earned commendations for his work in naval intelligence, and has been fast-tracked for promotion to full commander. But James carries secrets that go deeper than any submarine dive. As a communications officer with top-secret clearance, he has access to classified information about Soviet submarine movements, nuclear capabilities, and American defensive strategies. In an era when the wrong intelligence leak could trigger World War III, James Morrison knows things that could change the balance of global power. His wife, Catherine Morrison, 29, is the picture of 1960s military perfection, always impeccably dressed, never complaining about the long deployments, always ready with a smile for the other Navy wives. Catherine manages their household with military precision, volunteers at the base chapel, and hosts dinner parties for James's fellow officers. But beneath her composed exterior, Catherine struggles with the isolation and constant fear that comes with being married to a man whose job regularly takes him into harm's way. Their 7-year-old daughter, Rebecca, is a bright, curious child who adores her father but barely knows him due to his frequent absences. Rebecca has learned not to ask when Daddy will come home from his business trips, and she's grown accustomed to celebrating birthdays and holidays with just her mother. She's the kind of child who notices everything, but has been taught that military families don't discuss what happens at work. The Morrison family lives in a tight-knit community where everyone's husband has the same dangerous job, where wives share their fears over coffee, and children play games involving submarines and enemy agents. It's a world where secrets are a way of life, where classified is the answer to most questions, and where families learn to accept that the men they love might simply vanish one day and never return. But in this world of necessary secrets and patriotic sacrifice, some secrets are darker than others. Some secrets have nothing to do with national security and everything to do with personal betrayal. And sometimes, when those secrets finally surface, they destroy everything they were meant to protect. Tuesday, March 13, 1962, began like countless other mornings in the Morrison household. Catherine woke at 5:30 a.m., as she had every day for the past 8 years of military life, and began the familiar routine of preparing her husband for another day of classified work she wasn't allowed to understand. James emerged from their bedroom at exactly 6 a.m., dressed in his crisp Navy uniform with the silver oak leaves that marked his rank. He moved with the precision of a man accustomed to the cramped quarters of a submarine, every gesture economical and purposeful. Catherine had learned to read his moods in the subtle details, the way he adjusted his tie, the speed of his morning routine, the tone of his voice when he spoke to Rebecca. This morning something was different. James's usual calm confidence seemed forced, almost brittle. He checked his watch 3 times during breakfast, unusual for a man whose internal clock was typically accurate to the minute. When Rebecca asked him about her upcoming school play, he gave distracted, incomplete answers, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Are you feeling all right?" Catherine asked as she poured his coffee into the thermal mug he carried to work every day. "Just tired," James replied, but Catherine noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he reached for the mug. In 12 years of marriage, she had never seen her unflappable husband's hands shake. At 7:15 a.m., James kissed Catherine goodbye, a perfunctory peck on the cheek that lacked their usual warmth. He hugged Rebecca and told her to be good for her mother, but Catherine noticed he held their daughter a few seconds longer than usual, as if memorizing the moment. "I might be late tonight," James said from the doorway, his hand on the brass knob he had polished himself just the weekend before. "Don't wait up." Catherine watched from the kitchen window as James backed his black 1959 Buick LeSabre out of their driveway and disappeared down Ocean View Drive. She couldn't have known it would be the last time she would see her husband alive. At 9:30 a.m., James arrived at the Naval Submarine Base New London, where he was scheduled for a routine briefing with his commanding officer, Captain Robert Hayes. Security logs showed James badged into the Secure Communications Building at 9:42 a.m., 18 minutes later than his usual arrival time. Petty Officer Michael Chen, who worked in the Communications Center, later told investigators that Lieutenant Commander Morrison seemed agitated that morning. Morrison had requested access to several classified files that weren't related to his current assignments. Files dealing with submarine patrol routes and Soviet intelligence intercepts. He was always professional, always followed protocol, Chen recalled. But that morning he was asking questions about things that weren't his responsibility. When I pointed that out, he got angry, really angry. I'd never seen him lose his temper before. At 11:45 a.m., James attended a classified briefing about upcoming submarine deployments. 3 officers who were present later reported that Morrison seemed distracted and took extensive notes on information that should have been routine for someone of his experience level. The last confirmed sighting of James Morrison was at 2:17 p.m., when he was seen leaving the base's main security gate in his black Buick. The guard on duty, Seaman First Class David Rodriguez, remembered the interaction clearly because Morrison had seemed unusually rushed and had fumbled his identification card, something the typically composed officer had never done before. "He dropped his ID twice," Rodriguez told investigators. "When I asked if everything was okay, he just said he was late for an appointment." "But sir, officers like Lieutenant Commander Morrison don't get flustered about being late. Something was definitely wrong." Catherine Morrison spent that afternoon as she always did, grocery shopping at the base commissary, picking up Rebecca from school, and preparing dinner for whenever her husband might return home. Military wives learned to be flexible with mealtimes, understanding that classified work didn't follow a predictable schedule. By 8 p.m., Catherine began to worry. James had never failed to call if he was going to be significantly late, and he always made it home in time to say goodnight to Rebecca. She called the base's main number, but was told that Lieutenant Commander Morrison had left for the day and that no one could provide information about his whereabouts. At 10 p.m., Catherine's worry transformed into fear. She put Rebecca to bed with promises that Daddy would be home in the morning, then spent the night sitting by the living room window, watching for headlights that never appeared. Wednesday morning brought no news and no James. Catherine called the base again and was transferred between several departments before finally reaching Captain Hayes, James's commanding officer. "Mrs. Morrison," Captain Hayes said, his voice carrying the careful tone military officers used when discussing classified matters. "I'm afraid I can't discuss your husband's current assignment, What I can tell you is that Lieutenant Commander Morrison is involved in important work for his country, and communication may not be possible for some time." It was the kind of non-answer Catherine had learned to accept during 12 years as a Navy wife. Submarine officers often disappeared for weeks or months on classified missions, and families were expected to wait patiently for their return. But something felt different this time. Something in Captain Hayes's voice, a hesitation that suggested he was hiding more than just operational details. For 2 weeks, Catherine waited. No official communication came from the Navy. No letters arrived from James. No phone calls broke the terrible silence that had settled over their home like fog rolling in from the Atlantic. Then, on March 28, 1962, Captain Hayes appeared at Catherine's door in full dress uniform, accompanied by a Navy chaplain and a base social worker. Catherine knew before they spoke a single word that her world was about to collapse. "Mrs. Morrison," Captain Hayes began, his voice heavy with practiced solemnity, "I regret to inform you that your husband, Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, was killed in the line of duty while conducting a classified mission for the United States Navy." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. She gripped the doorframe to keep from falling as the chaplain stepped forward with gentle words about sacrifice and honor. According to Captain Hayes, James had been aboard a submarine that encountered mechanical difficulties during a classified operation in international waters. The incident had been contained, but unfortunately, Lieutenant Commander Morrison had been among the casualties. His body was lost at sea, Captain Hayes explained, "But please know that your husband died serving his country with the highest honor. He will be posthumously promoted to full commander and awarded the Navy Cross for his service." Catherine's grief was overwhelming, but even through her tears, questions began forming in her mind. James had never mentioned being assigned to submarine duty. His work was in communications and intelligence, not operational deployments. Moreover, she had spoken with other wives whose husbands were currently deployed, and none of them had mentioned losing contact with their spouses. The funeral service 3 days later was everything the Navy does best: honor guards, flag ceremonies, a 21-gun salute, and a burial at sea ceremony for the casket that contained only James's personal effects. The base chapel was filled with fellow officers, their wives, and the tight-knit community of submarine families who understood the price of serving beneath the waves. But Rebecca Morrison, 7 years old and sharp as her father, noticed something that the grieving adults missed. During the funeral service, she whispered to her mother, "Mommy, why is Captain Hayes's wife acting so strange?" Catherine looked across the chapel and saw Eleanor Hayes, the commanding officer's wife, who should have been a pillar of support during this tragedy. Instead, Eleanor appeared nervous, constantly checking her watch and avoiding eye contact with Catherine. When the two women had spoken briefly before the service, Eleanor's usual warmth had been replaced by an awkward distance that felt forced and uncomfortable. After the funeral, the official Navy investigation was swift and conclusive. Lieutenant Commander Morrison had died in a classified submarine accident, the details of which would remain sealed for national security reasons. The case was closed within a week, and Catherine was awarded a military widow's pension and the flag of honor that had covered her husband's empty casket. But one person refused to accept the official story. Seaman First Class David Rodriguez, the security guard who had seen James leave the base on March 13th. Rodriguez had been haunted by Morrison's strange behavior that day, and he began asking questions that made his superiors uncomfortable. "Sir," Rodriguez told his supervisor, Chief Petty Officer Williams, "I've checked with submarine operations, and there were no classified missions departing on March 13th. In fact, there were no submarine deployments scheduled for the entire week. How could Lieutenant Commander Morrison have been killed on a mission that never happened?" Chief Williams ordered Rodriguez to stop asking questions and to remember that some information was classified above his pay grade. But Rodriguez couldn't let it go. He began quietly investigating, checking duty rosters, submarine schedules, and personnel records. What Rodriguez discovered sent chills down his spine. Not only had there been no submarine missions on March 13th, but Lieutenant Commander Morrison's name didn't appear on any deployment orders for the entire month of March. According to official records, James Morrison was supposed to have been working his regular duty assignment at the communications center on the day he allegedly died at sea. Rodriguez faced an impossible choice. He could report his findings and potentially face court-martial for investigating classified matters beyond his authority, or he could stay quiet and let a lie stand as the official record. For 2 months, Rodriguez wrestled with his conscience while Catherine Morrison grieved for a husband who had supposedly died a hero's death. Everything changed on May 15, 1962, when Rodriguez was walking his girlfriend along the rocky coastline near Groton, searching for interesting shells and driftwood. Instead, they found something that would expose the truth behind Lieutenant Commander Morrison's disappearance and reveal a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the naval base command structure. What Rodriguez discovered that morning would prove that James Morrison hadn't died on a classified submarine mission. He had been murdered, and someone with significant authority had orchestrated an elaborate cover-up to hide the truth. When Seaman Rodriguez called the Connecticut State Police on May 15, 1962, his voice was shaking so badly that the dispatcher initially thought it might be a prank call. Rodriguez reported finding human remains along the coastline, but what made the call extraordinary was his insistence that the remains belonged to a Navy officer who had supposedly died in a submarine accident 2 months earlier. Detective Lieutenant Frank Sullivan of the Connecticut State Police was a 20-year veteran who had seen everything from domestic disputes to organized crime. But when he arrived at the rocky coastline near Groton and saw what Rodriguez had discovered, even Sullivan's experienced composure was shaken. Wedged between barnacle-covered rocks, partially hidden by seaweed and debris, were the badly decomposed remains of what appeared to be a human body. Shreds of Navy-issue uniform were still attached to the bones, and a corroded metal dog tag was tangled in what remained of the victim's hair. Detective Sullivan immediately contacted the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, expecting full cooperation in what appeared to be the tragic recovery of a sailor lost at sea. Instead, he encountered resistance that raised immediate red flags about the Navy's version of events. Captain Robert Hayes insisted that the remains couldn't possibly belong to Lieutenant Commander Morrison, since Morrison had been lost at sea during a classified operation in international waters far from the Connecticut coastline. Hayes demanded that the state police turn over the remains to Navy authorities for proper identification and burial. But Detective Sullivan had investigated enough cover-ups to recognize one when he saw it. He refused to release the remains until proper forensic identification could be completed by civilian authorities. This decision would save the case and ultimately expose the truth behind Morrison's murder. The Connecticut State Medical Examiner, Dr. Harold Brennan, was a forensic pioneer who had helped establish some of the first scientific methods for identifying decomposed remains. Dr. Brennan's examination of the body revealed several crucial details that contradicted the Navy's official story. First, the remains showed clear evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, specifically a depressed fracture consistent with being struck by a heavy object. This was not the kind of injury that would result from a submarine accident or drowning. Second, the condition of the bones and clothing suggested the body had been in the water for approximately 8 to 10 weeks. A timeline that matched perfectly with James Morrison's disappearance on March 13th, not with any submarine mission. Most significantly, dental records confirmed that the remains belonged to Lieutenant Commander James Morrison. The hero who had supposedly died serving his country in international waters had actually been murdered and dumped off the Connecticut coast. Detective Sullivan now faced a murder investigation that involved military personnel, classified information, and a conspiracy that someone with significant authority was desperate to keep hidden. Sullivan knew he needed to proceed carefully. One wrong move could result in the case being classified beyond his reach. Sullivan's first breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Eleanor Hayes, the wife of Captain Robert Hayes. 3 days after the remains were identified, Eleanor appeared at the state police station, visibly distraught and asking to speak with Detective Sullivan privately. "I can't live with this anymore," Eleanor told Sullivan, tears streaming down her face. "My husband has been lying about everything. James Morrison wasn't killed on any submarine mission. He was murdered, and Robert has been covering it up." Eleanor's confession opened the floodgates of a conspiracy that was far more complex and dangerous than Detective Sullivan had imagined. According to Eleanor, her husband Captain Hayes had been selling classified submarine intelligence to Soviet agents for over 2 years. James Morrison had discovered the espionage operation and was planning to report Hayes to federal authorities. Robert came home on March 13th in a complete panic, Eleanor told Sullivan. He said that Morrison had evidence that could send him to prison for treason. He said Morrison was going to ruin everything: our life, our family, his career. He was terrified and desperate. Eleanor revealed that her husband had arranged to meet with Morrison that evening under the pretense of discussing the intelligence leak. Instead, Hayes had killed Morrison and disposed of his body in the Atlantic Ocean, then orchestrated the fake submarine mission story to explain Morrison's disappearance. But Detective Sullivan was about to uncover evidence that the conspiracy went deeper than just Captain Hayes. Financial records subpoenaed from Hayes's personal bank accounts revealed payments totaling over $50,000 from sources that couldn't be easily explained on a Navy captain's salary. Phone records showed calls to numbers associated with known Soviet intelligence operatives. Most damning of all, Sullivan discovered that Hayes wasn't working alone. The elaborate cover-up required cooperation from multiple officers within the base command structure, suggesting a spy ring that had infiltrated the highest levels of the submarine base. The investigation revealed that Hayes had recruited at least 3 other officers into his espionage operation: Commander Paul Richardson, the base intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Mark Stevens, who worked in submarine operations, and Chief Petty Officer Thomas Walsh, who had access to classified communications equipment. Each conspirator had been paid substantial sums for providing specific types of intelligence: submarine patrol routes, sonar technology specifications, nuclear reactor designs, and communication frequencies used by American submarines. The information they provided had given Soviet submarines significant advantages in tracking and potentially targeting American naval assets. James Morrison's murder hadn't been a crime of passion. It had been a calculated decision to protect a multi-million-dollar espionage operation that was providing the Soviet Union with some of America's most closely guarded military secrets. As Detective Sullivan dug deeper into the espionage ring, he uncovered evidence that stunned even experienced federal investigators. James Morrison hadn't just discovered Captain Hayes' spy operation by accident. Morrison had been conducting his own undercover investigation for the FBI. FBI Special Agent Robert McNeil, who had been working with Morrison for 6 months before his death, revealed that the Navy communications officer had approached federal authorities in September 1961 with suspicions about security breaches at the submarine base. Morrison had noticed that classified information was finding its way to Soviet intelligence with alarming frequency and precision. Lieutenant Commander Morrison was one of the most patriotic officers I ever worked with, Agent McNeil told Detective Sullivan during a classified briefing. He risked his career and his life to expose traitors within his own command structure. He was supposed to deliver final evidence about the spy ring on March 14, 1962, the day after he was murdered. The evidence Morrison had gathered was hidden in a safety deposit box at a Groton bank, secured with a key he had given to his wife Catherine for emergency purposes. When federal agents opened the box, they found photographs of classified documents, recorded conversations with fellow officers, and detailed logs of information that had been leaked to enemy agents. Morrison's investigation had identified not just the 4 conspirators Sullivan had already discovered, but evidence of a much larger network that included civilian contractors, defense industry employees, and potentially other military installations along the East Coast. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Among Morrison's evidence was proof that the spy ring had been planning to provide the Soviet Union with detailed specifications for America's newest nuclear submarine technology. Information that could have shifted the balance of the Cold War and put countless American sailors at risk. The operation Morrison had uncovered was worth millions of dollars to Soviet intelligence and represented one of the most serious national security breaches in American history. His murder hadn't just been about protecting Captain Hayes from exposure. It had been about protecting a massive espionage network that threatened the security of the entire United States. Eleanor Hayes's confession had been motivated by more than guilt about her husband's crimes. She revealed to Detective Sullivan that Hayes had been planning to eliminate other potential witnesses, including Catherine Morrison and possibly even 7-year-old Rebecca. Robert was becoming paranoid, Eleanor told investigators. He said Morrison might have told his wife about the investigation, that she could be a threat. He was talking about having them transferred to a different base, or worse. I couldn't let him hurt that little girl. Federal agents moved quickly to place Catherine and Rebecca Morrison under protective custody while they gathered evidence against the remaining conspirators. The investigation had expanded from a murder case to a matter of national security that involved multiple federal agencies and reached the highest levels of the Pentagon. But detectives were about to uncover something worse, evidence that the spy ring had been responsible for at least 2 other deaths that had been covered up as military accidents. The arrests began at dawn on June 18, 1962, when federal agents and military police simultaneously raided the homes and offices of all 4 conspirators. The coordinated operation was designed to prevent the destruction of evidence and to minimize the risk that any of the spies might flee to Soviet protection. Captain Robert Hayes was arrested at his home while still in his pajamas, found frantically trying to burn documents in his backyard fireplace. Among the papers agents recovered were detailed maps of submarine patrol routes, photographs of classified sonar equipment, and coded communications with Soviet intelligence handlers. When confronted with the evidence against him, Hayes initially maintained his innocence and demanded to speak with military counsel. But when agents showed him Morrison's FBI recordings, including a conversation in which Hayes explicitly discussed selling submarine intelligence, his composure finally cracked. "You don't understand the pressure we were under," Hayes said during his first interrogation, his voice breaking as he faced the reality of life imprisonment or execution for treason. The Soviets had compromising photographs, evidence of gambling debts. They said they'd destroy my career and my family if I didn't cooperate. Hayes's confession revealed the sophisticated methods Soviet intelligence had used to recruit and control their assets within the submarine base. The operation had begun with seemingly innocent social contacts, parties, golf games, fishing trips, during which Soviet agents had gradually identified officers with financial problems, family secrets, or personal vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Commander Paul Richardson had been recruited after the Soviets discovered his homosexuality, a revelation that would have ended his military career in 1960s America. Lieutenant Commander Mark Stevens had been compromised through his gambling addiction and mounting debts from Atlantic City casinos. Chief Petty Officer Thomas Walsh had been blackmailed with evidence of an extramarital affair that would have destroyed his marriage. Each man had started by providing small pieces of information in exchange for money or to prevent personal destruction. But once they began cooperating, the Soviets had them completely under control, demanding increasingly sensitive intelligence, and making it clear that exposure meant not just career destruction, but potential prosecution for treason. James Morrison's murder had been planned for weeks after he began asking questions about security breaches within the communications center. Hayes had arranged the meeting under the pretense of discussing Morrison's concerns, then killed him with a tire iron in a wooded area near the base. "I never meant for it to happen," Hayes claimed, though evidence suggested otherwise. Morrison was going to expose everything. He said he had evidence that would send all of us to prison for life. I just wanted to scare him, to make him understand what was at stake. But Morrison's FBI recordings prove that Hayes had been planning to eliminate him for weeks. In one chilling conversation, Hayes had discussed with Richardson the need to permanently solve the Morrison problem before the investigation could proceed. The cover-up had required the cooperation of multiple base personnel who weren't part of the spy ring, but were convinced to participate through a combination of misinformation and appeals to loyalty. Hayes had told subordinates that Morrison's death needed to be classified to protect ongoing intelligence operations and national security. Federal prosecutors faced a complex decision about how to handle the case. The espionage charges carried potential death sentences, but prosecuting the case publicly would expose sensitive information about submarine operations and intelligence methods. Ultimately, military tribunals were convened to try the four main conspirators, while civilian courts handled related charges. The evidence against all four men was overwhelming. Beyond Hayes's confession, investigators had recovered thousands of classified documents from Soviet dead drops, bank records showing payments from intelligence services, and Morrison's detailed FBI recordings of incriminating conversations. On November 15, 1962, exactly 8 months after James Morrison's murder, Captain Robert Hayes was sentenced to death by military tribunal for treason, espionage, and murder. Commander Richardson received life imprisonment, while Stevens and Walsh were sentenced to 30 years each in federal prison. Eleanor Hayes, who had provided crucial testimony that helped expose the entire network, received immunity from prosecution in exchange for her cooperation. She divorced her husband and moved to California with their 2 children, living under assumed names for their protection. The investigation ultimately revealed that the spy ring had been responsible for compromising American submarine operations for over 2 years, potentially putting hundreds of sailors at risk and giving Soviet forces significant advantages in underwater warfare capabilities. The execution of Captain Robert Hayes took place on March 13, 1963, exactly 1 year after he murdered Lieutenant Commander James Morrison. Hayes spent his final months in military prison at Fort Leavenworth, maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his crimes and expressing no remorse for Morrison's death. In a final letter to Eleanor, which was intercepted and reviewed by federal authorities, Hayes wrote, "I did what I thought was necessary to protect our family and our way of life. History will judge whether I was a traitor or simply a man caught between impossible choices." The letter showed no acknowledgement of the damage his actions had caused to national security or the Morrison family. Catherine Morrison and her daughter Rebecca were relocated to a secure military facility in Virginia, while federal investigators determined whether other Soviet agents might target them. The investigation had revealed that the spy ring had maintained detailed files on military families, including surveillance reports on Catherine's daily routines and Rebecca's school schedule. After 6 months in protective custody, Catherine and Rebecca were given new identities and relocated to a small town in Colorado, far from any military installations. Catherine struggled with the double trauma of losing her husband to murder and learning that their entire life at the submarine base had been built on lies and danger. "I keep thinking about all the dinner parties we hosted for Robert Hayes," Catherine told FBI agents during her debriefing. "He sat at our kitchen table, played with Rebecca, knew all our family secrets. The whole time, he was planning to kill my husband and possibly us too." Rebecca Morrison, now 8 years old, required extensive psychological counseling to help her understand why her family had to disappear and start over. Child psychologists noted that she frequently drew pictures of submarines and sharks, symbolically representing the hidden dangers that had lurked beneath the surface of her previously secure world. The naval submarine base New London underwent massive security reforms following the exposure of the spy ring. All personnel with access to classified information were subjected to enhanced background checks, polygraph examinations, and regular psychological evaluations. New protocols were implemented to detect and prevent the kind of financial and personal compromise that had enabled Soviet recruitment. The base also established the James Morrison Memorial for Intelligence Security, recognizing the ultimate sacrifice made by an officer who had died protecting his country's secrets. Morrison was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, making him one of the few military personnel to receive the nation's highest civilian honor for intelligence work. The broader investigation revealed that the Groton spy ring was part of a much larger Soviet intelligence operation targeting American military installations across the country. Federal authorities ultimately identified and prosecuted 17 additional individuals connected to the network, including defense contractors, civilian employees, and military personnel at other bases. The case led to fundamental changes in how the United States protected classified military information during the Cold War. New compartmentalization procedures ensured that no single individual could access enough intelligence to compromise entire operational systems. Enhanced counterintelligence training became mandatory for all personnel handling sensitive information. Commander Paul Richardson died in federal prison in 1987, never revealing the full extent of his cooperation with Soviet intelligence. Lieutenant Commander Mark Stevens was released in 1992 after serving 30 years and lived quietly in Florida until his death in 2003. Chief Petty Officer Thomas Walsh served his full sentence and died in 1998, having spent his final years working as a security guard at a shopping mall in Ohio. The Groton spy case became a classified case study used to train future intelligence and counterintelligence officers, though the full details weren't declassified until 1997. The case highlighted the vulnerability of military personnel to foreign recruitment and the devastating consequences when national security is compromised by personal weakness. Detective Frank Sullivan, who had refused to allow the Navy to bury the truth about Morrison's death, was commended by both state and federal authorities for his persistence in the face of official pressure. Sullivan later became chief of detectives for the Connecticut State Police and specialized in cases involving government corruption and cover-ups. The Morrison case taught me never to accept official explanations when the evidence doesn't add up, Sullivan reflected years later. Sometimes the people in authority are the ones with the most to hide. The case also exposed significant flaws in military justice and security procedures that had allowed Hayes to operate undetected for years. Congressional hearings in 1963 led to new oversight procedures for military intelligence operations and stronger protections for military personnel who reported security violations. Eleanor Hayes lived under an assumed name in California until her death in 1994. Never remarrying and rarely speaking about her experience as the wife of a convicted traitor. Her children, who had been too young to understand their father's crimes, learned the truth only when they reached adulthood and struggled with the legacy of being the children of one of America's most notorious military traitors. The Soviet intelligence officers who had run the Groton operation were never prosecuted, having diplomatic immunity or having fled the country before their involvement was discovered. KGB archives released after the Cold War confirmed that the intelligence stolen from the submarine base had indeed provided significant advantages to Soviet naval forces throughout the 1960s. The Morrison case stands as one of the most complex and devastating betrayals in American military history, a story that combines murder, espionage, and institutional cover-up in ways that challenged everything the submarine service represented about honor, duty, and sacrifice. James Morrison's decision to risk his life investigating treason within his own command structure represents the highest ideals of military service. In an era when questioning authority was often seen as disloyalty, Morrison chose to follow his conscience and protect his country's secrets, even knowing that exposure could destroy his career and endanger his family. Catherine Morrison's strength in rebuilding her life after losing everything, her husband, her home, her identity, and her sense of safety, demonstrates remarkable resilience in the face of unimaginable trauma. She not only survived the murder of her husband, but also the devastating knowledge that their entire military community had been compromised by people they had trusted as friends. For 7-year-old Rebecca Morrison, the case represents the ultimate loss of innocence. learning that the world she thought was safe and predictable was actually filled with hidden dangers, and that the adults she trusted to protect her had themselves been threatened by people who appeared to be family friends. Detective Frank Sullivan's refusal to accept the Navy's cover-up story shows how crucial it is for civilian law enforcement to maintain independence from institutional pressure, even when that pressure comes from military or government authorities claiming national security concerns. The case reveals how foreign intelligence services exploit personal vulnerabilities to turn patriotic Americans into traitors. Hayes, Richardson, Stevens, and Walsh weren't ideological converts to communism. They were men whose personal weaknesses made them susceptible to blackmail and financial incentives. Their betrayals weren't motivated by political beliefs, but by fear, greed, and self-preservation. Perhaps most chillingly, the Morrison case demonstrates how easily institutional authority can be used to hide terrible crimes. Hayes's ability to orchestrate a cover-up that was accepted without question by his subordinates shows how hierarchical structures can become tools for protecting corruption rather than serving their intended purposes. The spy ring's success for over 2 years also highlights the devastating consequences when security systems fail. The intelligence stolen from the Groton base potentially compromised the safety of thousands of American submarine crew members and gave Soviet forces advantages that could have changed the outcome of Cold War naval confrontations. The case occurred during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War, when the Cuban Missile Crisis and other confrontations brought the world close to nuclear warfare. The submarine intelligence that Hayes and his conspirators provided to Soviet agents could have tipped the balance in underwater conflicts that might have escalated into global catastrophe. But ultimately, the Morrison case is about the power of individual conscience and courage in the face of institutional corruption. James Morrison's willingness to investigate crimes within his own command, Eleanor Hayes's decision to expose her husband's cover-up, and Seaman Rodriguez's refusal to accept official lies all demonstrate how ordinary people can serve justice when official systems fail. The case also shows how truth has a way of surfacing, even when poor people with significant resources try to bury it. Hayes's elaborate cover-up might have succeeded if not for the combination of Morrison's FBI investigation, Rodriguez's persistent questions, and the simple fact that bodies don't always stay hidden beneath the waves. For the submarine service, the Morrison case represented a fundamental reckoning with the reality that the closed, secretive culture necessary for underwater warfare could also enable and protect serious crimes. The security reforms implemented after the case helped prevent similar betrayals, but they also changed the culture of trust that had previously defined submarine communities. The human cost of the case extended far beyond the immediate victims. Every family at the Groton base had to confront the possibility that their neighbors, friends, and fellow service members might not be who they seemed to be. The bonds of trust that held military communities together were shattered by the revelation that traitors had been living among them for years. Today, the rocky coastline where Morrison's remains were discovered is still visited by military families from the Groton base. Some come to remember a hero who died protecting his country's secrets. Others come to reflect on the hidden dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most trusted institutions. The ocean has always kept its secrets well, hiding wrecks and mysteries beneath its dark waters. But sometimes, as James Morrison's case proves, the ocean gives up its secrets to those who are brave enough to look for the truth, even when that truth is more terrible than anyone could have imagined. In the end, the Morrison case reminds us that heroism isn't always about dramatic acts of courage on distant battlefields. Sometimes heroism is simply about choosing to do what's right when doing what's right could cost you everything. James Morrison paid the ultimate price for that choice, but his sacrifice exposed a network of traitors and protected the secrets that kept his fellow sailors safe beneath the waves. The ocean's dark secret had been revealed, justice had been served, and the truth had finally surfaced from the depths where someone had tried to bury it forever.